All Things Unexplained. Hosted by Dr. Mounts.
Let's face it, we were always ready to roll without him anyway.
CJ Derringer.
Ain't nobody perfect, right?
And Smitty Needs.
I've never planned out hardly anything my whole life. I just freeball.
Featuring Cajun Man.
I'm just old nobody. Somebody's looking for somebody.
It's Halloween 2022. I'm Dr. Mounts. We're back with All Things Unexplained. CJ Derringer's with us.
Hello, hello.
CJ, how's it going tonight?
Oh, good. I know that I am going to be losing sleep after this episode. All things spooky.
That makes it a successful Halloween episode. We're doing ghost stories tonight. Smitty, he's back with us.
I should have wore black. That way I'd been back in black like AC/DC, but I didn't.
And we have got special guests with us, here with us on very short notice. We really appreciate him. He's an Asheville, North Carolina historian. He's currently working on a big regional project of a 60s music project for Gear Fab Records Psychedelic State Series, the Carolinas in the 1960s. Let's welcome to All Things Unexplained, Vance Pollock.
Glad to be here.
Folks can go to localmusicscenesc.com/news to find out more about your big project, the Carolinas in the 1960s. Maybe you could tell everybody what that's about exactly.
Well, during the 1960s, there was this nationwide phenomena, actually, of young people, particularly in the wake of the Beatles, putting together rock bands. And they played some talent shows or some sock hops or dances around town, but they were virtually unknown, over the mountain or 50 miles down the road. This is going to be volume 26 of Gear Fab Records Psychedelic State series, and it's going to cover teenage rock and roll bands from North and South Carolina during the 1960s. Some really great songs, forgotten gems from the local high schools all over the place, actually. And some of these songs haven't ever been re-released since they were cut as 45 RPM records, 55 years or more ago. You're talking about musicians who were primarily teenagers at the time, and they're septuagenarians now.
Did any of them make it big?
The only sort of success stories some of these groups had was that they did garner some regional radio play. And some of them were talented enough that they were invited to play at places like Myrtle Beach, of course, which was a huge music scene. I've talked to a number of these guys that when they were invited to play at the Pavilion at Myrtle Beach, that was like a thrill to them to go down there, during the summer or spring break and have girls screaming and fawning over them, and they felt like superstars just a little bit. But as far as making millions and having a hit seller or chart records, virtually none. Almost no stories like that.
I bet they weren't playing the shag. I bet they weren't playing shag music in Myrtle.
Well, the bands on Psychedelic States series tend to focus on, your straight up guitar, bass, drums, and vocal, and maybe some Farfisa, keyboards thrown in there once in a while, a la 96 Tears.
Oh, yeah. Well, we've brought Vance Pollock here with us tonight, Asheville, North Carolina historian, to tell us a little bit more about some creepy things from Asheville's past. And Vance, one of those, started going up in the late 1800s, a mountaintop castle by the name of Zealandia.
Yeah, Zealandia, actually on Bowcatcher Mountain or Bowcatcher Ridge, is a very, very mysterious place, and it was built by a man by the name of John Evans Brown, and it actually looked like a castle on the hillside, and it was named Zealandia because as a young man, John Evans Brown had gone to New Zealand, and he was actually a member of Parliament in New Zealand, and he was a successful sheep farmer down there and rancher, and so he came back to the United States with a fortune he had made in New Zealand, and he built this this grand estate on Bowcatcher. Along about 1904, the character it looms large in most of the ghost stories associated with Bowcatcher in the Zealandia area, Sir Philip Henry, a very wealthy Englishman, purchased the estate. He remodeled that castle structure into a Tudor style mansion, and he built what is known today as Helen's Bridge over a gap on the property. He actually owned parcels on both sides of the ridge, and he built this bridge over the gap, and it was known at the time as Henry's Bridge or Zealandia Bridge, but today most properly known as Helen's Bridge because of the ghost who allegedly haunts these environs. Oh yeah, that's a fantastic early photograph of it before the road was paved, and it looks very much like that today. There's a few more trees and growth and everything on the banks, but it's unmistakable. Yeah, there's a more modern view of it. Helen's Bridge. I think factually, the thing about the ghosts at Helen's Bridge, whatever variation of the story is being told, I think the fact that it's a fairly secluded spot within 5 minutes or so of downtown, and it's accessible to teenagers, lends well to ghost stories. All the high school kids after the football game on Friday night, they need a local haunt, literally. They need someplace
Oh
where
yeah.
they go and uh, you know get a good scare, uh, send goosebumps down
Yes.
one another's spines, and it seems to me that a group of teenagers egging one another on, encouraging one another, and telling these sort of campfire stories is Bridge evolved, and there are what I would call an amalgam of true events that sort of go toward piecing together the modern telling of the Helen's Bridge story. The most popular account, as told in my friend Joshua P. Warren's book, Haunted Asheville, is that there was a lady who was working on Philip Henry's estate at Zealandia, and there was a fire, and she was so distraught that she couldn't take it anymore. She hung herself from the bridge. And since that time, if you go there on a moonlit night and it's all quiet and you call out, "Helen, come forth! Helen, come forth! Helen, come forth!" then she will appear.
Ooh.
And now I've been up there. I was up there the first time probably as a teenager with some of my cousins that went to and something that one out of, I'd say, every 3 or 4 people who have hung around up there much will tell you is that their car stalled or wouldn't start,
Oh.
or they saw, ghostly handprints on the glass. And in some cases, in a related story, people have said that were actually handprint in trunk lid into paint on the trunk of their car, and someone pushed their car down the mountain. So this sort of thing is really really good fodder for ghost stories, and it's chilling stuff. And to be up there on the mountain on a misty, chilly night, much like this time of year. And as I was going back over some of the news clippings that I sent you today, I noticed Helen's Bridge was being built exactly 115 years ago, because it was announced in mid-October of 1907 that the bridge would begin construction, and then about mid-November 1907 it was announced that construction on the bridge had completed. So you're talking about 115 years ago, there were workmen up there on the mountain constructing what is known as Helen's Bridge. You pulled up a clip there about a very tragic incident that would have played directly with the bridge. Sir Philip Henry built the first bridge. It was a temporary structure, a wooden structure, I believe, over the gap in about 1905. Well, the next year, his personal valet, a man named James Monnery, as noted here, 25 years old, he's staying on the adjoining parcel up the mountain over the bridge from Zealandia in what was a boarding house or a workman's bunkhouse. And no one understands why. By all accounts, he was in a good mood that morning, but some men who went up to the boarding house and were coming down the hall about 10:30 one morning in May in 1906 looked into James Monnery's room and saw him laying in a pool of blood.
Mm.
Oh no.
And he had ended it all, and the coroner's jury declared that it was self-inflicted, and he was, by the newspaper account, if you pull that entire account, it mentions that he was very dear to Sir Philip Henry. He was a young Englishman. Philip Henry had brought him to the U.S. to be a servant, personal servant to him, and it was said that he thought of him as a son. So imagine the trauma, the tragedy of losing someone that close to you, quite unexpectedly. And certainly I do believe that most of the more popular ghost stories hinge on a traumatic event like that, whether it be a suicide or a car accident or a murder. Some form of trauma or tragedy seems to leave a very deep impression where these popular ghost stories are concerned.
Oh yeah, one interesting thing, Vance, I thought about Zealandia was that apparently it went up about the same time as the famous mansion Biltmore and a couple of other mansions around there in Asheville. And you and I had actually talked about this. I wonder, and CJ and I talked about this. I wonder, I feel like there was probably in that time such a dichotomy between poor and rich, right? Like I feel like the poor, they probably didn't have time for debaucherous, evil things to be happening. And it just makes me wonder, like, how many, was there a connection, I wonder, between the famous, because I read about the Biltmores going over for dinner parties at Zealandia. Do you think the rich just had more freedom to be debaucherous and for evil things to kind of be, on their timeline, so to speak?
I think they certainly had a more glamorous setting for types of things of this nature. But my mother grew up in the deep mountains in poverty, a couple of counties away near Burnsville, North Carolina. And there are just as many ghost stories and murder stories and things like that in the deep rural areas, but they aren't as glamorous. They aren't maybe as universal or as They don't really tend to attract attention, of the sort that the Vanderbilts or the Groves, Grove Park Inn is notorious for their pink lady.
I just want to point out real quickly that, what you're saying, Tim, is interesting, but in this particular case, both of the deaths mentioned were people that worked for the families, not people in the families. So I'm not sure how that ties in with having more time for debauchery. Both of these people were part of the staff, it sounds, and both took their lives. So what does that tell you about their jobs with those people?
They got worked to death.
Yeah, in this case, it was the tragedy of workers, but I think that there is a certain grain of truth to the fire story, which we never were able to document that there had been a fatal fire on the Henry estate at Zealandia. But just before he arrived in Asheville, Sir Philip Henry's wife, Florine Henry, had perished in a hotel fire in New York City.
Oh, my.
So I have a feeling that he carried some of this lore along with him, and it was misconstrued and retold and rehashed and married in with other local grander tales, such as the Helen Clevenger murder in 1936 in Battery Park Hotel. I think that the name Helen may have been borrowed from Helen Clevenger, who was murdered in the Battery Park Hotel downtown Asheville in 36.
Oh.
But out at Grove Park Inn, where the pink lady roams the halls, and she is also alleged to have been a lady of the evening, a call girl or a escort.
We can read between the lines.
Supplemental income.
Right, who threw herself off the balcony into Palm Court. And it's further said that the reason we can't document this or find anything about it is that the establishment there did not want that news to get out. Much like I mentioned in our communication briefly that Biltmore Estate, and I've heard this again and again, that they have a non-disclosure clause in their employment contract that if you're working on the Biltmore grounds or in the estate and you have ghostly experiences, you will not publicize them. You will not talk about them.
So wow.
Because that's not the image that Biltmore is trying to promote. Even though they could do a heck of a Halloween event, but that's not what they're pushing for there. But out at Grove Park Inn, they have the pink lady, and in the adjoining property, there is a beautiful set of shops and a museum called Grovewood. The Grovewood Gallery is based on what was the Biltmore Industries homespun shops. They had textiles. They made blankets and some lovely textiles there that Eleanor Roosevelt and other famous characters of the day touted the value and the quality of this Biltmore homespun goods, and they were manufactured right there on the grounds of the Grove Park Inn. And today, Grovewood is, like I say, a museum. There's an antique automobile museum there, and the factory where these linens were actually produced is just like a time capsule. It's just like the workers clocked out one day and never came back. And you walk down the halls of this large factory building, and there's looms still threaded on the either side of you. And there's a huge coffee urn that must have held like 15 gallons of coffee, attesting to the number of people that would work there. And right, absolutely. In 2009, I was up there with Joshua P. Warren's Lemur team, and the Lemur team is an acronym for the League of Energy Materialization and Unexplained Phenomena Research.
Ooh, that's cool.
That's incredible.
I think Josh may have created that around the name lemur just because he thought lemurs were cool animals or something. But anyway, it's quite unique that I got to hang around with this gang that were basically like the Scooby-Doo mystery hunters. And in 2009, we were out at Grovewood, and we were told by staff there that a night watchman had committed suicide in that building, and that was he was blamed for some of the ghostly activity at Grovewood, particularly in the museum building, which at the time had been the office. And this is 2009. Again, at the time, I was going online trying to document a suicide on the Grovewood property, and I never was able to do that. I just sent Joshua P. Warren an email the other day and told him that I had taken some of our family who were visiting out to the Grovewood galleries, and the gentleman who was watching over the automobile museum just quite, he just up and said, "Would you like to go in the old factory building?" And I was like, "Guys, we better do that, because not everybody gets an invitation to go the halls of the old factory building." And I said, it absolutely has this ghostly atmosphere, because I tell you, it's been closed for 70 years or whatever, but it's like I said, those people just left work one day and everything is just how they left it. An absolute time capsule. And every footstep creates this cloud of dust. And if the light is coming through the window just right, and you see the dust motes rise in the sunbeams, it has a ghostly appearance. And so I told my sister-in-law and her boys, I said, we better take them up on this offer. And we went down and we walked the halls, and I emailed Josh and I said, for the first time since 2009, I walked the halls in the old Biltmore Industries factory, and it was just as atmospheric and just as satisfying to me as a ghoul as it ever was. And I said, it's a shame we didn't ever pin down the details about this night watchman who allegedly killed himself there. And then, wouldn't you know it, in a grand display of synchronicity, I come home and I've got an email waiting from a young man who is a docent out there at Grovewood. And he says, Vance, I was doing some research, and I found that you were out with Joshua P. Warren at the Grovewood property some years ago, looking into the alleged suicide of a night watchman. And do you have any more information on that? And it occurred to me that in the period between 2009 and today, a number of Asheville newspapers, daily newspapers, have been digitized, maybe searchable. So I went in and I tried out a few terms, and I discovered that in 1935, a gentleman by the name of Harry Burgess, this is the first time his name has been broadcast, perhaps since 1935, an older gentleman, by the name of Harry Burgess, who was the night watchman at Grovewood Galleries, had shot himself and died in the office there. So, I mean, there are facts to that story, but it's been 13 years proving it, just because we didn't have access to the facts until digitizing newspapers is fantastic. You can read details down to the society columns and learn things about people who you wouldn't have had any idea where to start in the old days, just spinning through microfilm. But we found Harry Burgess, and I might add, he happened to have been a Scotsman. So you've got these English workers committing suicide here in Asheville, and I think that maybe Harry Burgess and James Monnery, even though it was some 30 years apart, they were in similar situations, and who knows why they've done it, but there's some trace of their spirit or energy left behind. I truly believe that.
Wow. We're speaking with Vance Pollock, Asheville, North Carolina historian. One thing I really wanted to ask you, Vance, there's so much paranormal activity associated with Asheville, North Carolina. Why do you think that is?
Well, I'll borrow some of Joshua P. Warren's explanations, because I buy a lot of that. He's a P.T. Barnum. He's a snake oil salesman. But some of some of the excuses and explanations he gives make as good a sense as any, and he is quite a yarn spinner. Josh says that the Smoky Mountains, being one of the oldest mountain ranges in the world, and also acting as a capacitor. Of course, you guys are probably familiar or have at least heard of the Brown Mountain Lights.
Yeah.
Yes, I wanted to ask you about those too.
The very crust of the earth here, the very rock form at Quart here, acts as a capacitor for energies that we can't explain yet. The unexplained is just like attracted like a magnet to Asheville and Western North Carolina in general. I've been told that Bowcatcher, where Zealandia is, where Helen's Bridge is, in the old days, was very active for strange weather phenomena. Ground lightning and things like that were very often reported along Bowcatcher Ridge. And in the late 70s, I suppose it was, the highway department blasted a large gap through the mountain where Interstate 240, which is the Asheville bypass, I-240 goes through the open cut now, and the open cut was actually made through Bowcatcher Ridge just below the Zealandia estate. And I'm told by old timers who lived on the mountain or grew up on the mountain that perhaps the energy is not as strong now as it was previously. That somehow we've broken a circuit by disturbing the earth. So I really do think that in some ways these paranormal reports are closely tied to earth energies.
I love that explanation. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
The more that we do this show, the more that I have begun to believe in these energies and spirits and what lies beyond what we can't see and the unexplained and what else exists out there. So I do really like that explanation of this different energy coming towards Western North Carolina. And let's talk about those Brown Mountain Lights, because Tim, I know you've mentioned them to me before and you've been very curious about them, but I don't know that I know much about what they are or what people are seeing.
Well, there are a lot of theories about the Brown Mountain Lights, whether they're some of the older explanations were that it was swamp gas on the mountain, the so-called will-o'-the-wisp. My father explained that he had seen spontaneous gas combustion in the swamps in Florida as a young man, that they were camping on a dark night, and then suddenly the woods around them lit up bright enough, that they could see and count the trees, 100 yards off. And that was swamp gas, or what some people will associate with the will-o'-the-wisp. And the first time I ever heard stories about the Brown Mountain Lights, that's kind of what I associated it with, was the foolish fire, the will-o'-the-wisp, the ignis fatuus. And it's similar to a lot of other folk stories and mystery lights the world over. It just so happens that they're very strong and almost reliable.
Have you seen them?
At Brown Mountain, even though I've been up there looking for them so many times, and I have never seen them.
Oh, okay.
But I don't quit trying. I'll go up there anytime and look.
Is there a particular vantage point where you would have to be to see them?
Oh, there are several popular places to look for them. On Highway 181, north of Morganton, near Linville Falls, is an overlook, Brown Mountain overlook. A lot of people like to go to Wiseman's View. There's an overlook known as Wiseman's View that is a popular viewing spot. And some people say that they've seen the Brown Mountain lights on Table Rock, which is a popular hiking trail, and it's a landmark in the Linville Gorge area. Table Rock is as well known for its lights as Brown Mountain proper, I believe. But they try to excuse it. The skeptics try to excuse it, and they say, oh, it's train lights, or it's this, or it's that, and try to explain it away. But there's still this mystery and this allure. And I don't know that you necessarily want to believe in the Brown Mountain lights. If you were to go up there and see a good example of what people call the Brown Mountain lights, you would be mystified. It doesn't matter how much of a skeptic or how much of a hard science person, you would be impressed and mystified by these lights.
Oh, now I need to go see them.
I bet. I mean, we definitely need a field trip. We're only a few hours away.
Oh, yeah.
To see the Brown Mountain lights. And it's always on my agenda. Every time I go out that way, it's always on my agenda to go try to look.
Has anybody ever compared it to ball lightning?
That's been suggested. Again, there's nothing conclusive. And even, there are some spotty videos that purport to show the Brown Mountain lights, and there's nothing really consistent or conclusive about the way people describe them or the way they're portrayed. But some people are satisfied to say ball lightning, but I think it's something different. Joshua P. Warren, he got some night vision footage of it. Some pretty good definition stuff years ago, and it literally looks like a group of people walking and carrying torches at night.
Oh,
because they kind of bob and hover. They move along the ridge, and that's one of the most popular ghost stories, is that after the Catawba and the Cherokee Indians great battle on Brown Mountain, that the Indian maidens went looking for those warriors who were lost in battle, and they went back at night by torchlight to look for the missing braves. And so that's one of the earliest folk legends, is that it's the ghosts of the Indian maidens looking for their fallen warriors.
That's a good legend. I mean, sad legend, but
that's pretty interesting.
I like that thought of torches sort of going into the dark, looking for fallen warriors.
Right, and it explains the idea that they can be seen, several yards apart, and multiple lights. It's not just one light like you hear about some of the railroad lights. I think the Mako lights was a regional story about that. The conductor was walking down the side of the railroad tracks with his lantern, and he got hit and decapitated or whatever. So anyway, now you can stand on the railroad tracks and see the light bobbing down the tracks, and it's supposedly the conductor who was killed there on the line. That's his lantern coming down the tracks. But that's always a solitary light. But at Brown Mountain, sometimes there's an entire group of lights, almost like a search party, carrying torches, and it's eerie. Even the footage is eerie, but to stand out there at the overlook, I think maybe the excitement, again, harkening back to a good ghost story being the encouragement of teenagers, maybe just the excitement of possibly seeing something like that. It's always a exciting feeling to be up there, staring over in the valley at Brown Mountain.
We'll have to go and check it out. All this talk of ghost stories being egged on by teenagers just makes me think that this was just a way for boys to get some young girl to clutch onto their arm under bridges and looking at lights.
Could be.
Oh yeah, certainly. Yeah, Bowcatcher and Helen's Bridge are also notorious makeout spots. So yeah.
I wonder if anybody ever had their first date at Helen's Bridge. Like if there's a marriage that started at Helen's Bridge.
There are probably Ashevilleans who were conceived at Helen's Bridge.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, see, if 80s slasher movies taught us anything, it was don't go make out at night in your car. Don't do it. Vance, you mentioned earlier about, the suicides that have been documented at various places in Asheville, North Carolina. And we're talking to Vance Pollock, Asheville historian. One of our previous guests, who turns out, I believe that you actually know him, Detective Scott Lunsford, who we like to call the Fox Mulder of the Asheville Police Department. He told us that he would, and I believe it was the Grove Park Inn, but I could be wrong about that, but there was a particular hotel in Asheville, and they would get calls out there all the time from witnesses who were, convinced that they saw somebody jump off the top to their death.
You are right. I forgot about that story.
And they would go out there all the time for these calls, and they'd get out there. Guess what? There's nobody to be found.
No body, no nothing.
I have documented that after the the big stock market crash in 1929, when there were a lot of suicides, spurred on by people's financial losses, or people thinking that their business was all their hopes and dreams were dashed because all of a sudden they were flat broke. And if you look in the early, in the newspapers in months to follow, for instance, the Asheville mayor at the time, Gallatin Roberts, committed suicide for financial reasons in 1930, maybe. Anyway, right on the tail of the great, the big stock market crash in 29. But you had people coming to Asheville because there were actually hotel buildings tall enough to kill yourself off of. The Jackson Building, Western North Carolina's first skyscrapers, and it's a beautiful building, and one of the strange things about it, I don't know whose idea this was, but the tile pattern on the plaza directly in front of the Jackson Building looks like a huge bullseye, as if if you were up on top of the Jackson Building and on dive to the ground, you would aim for, and right in the plaza in front of the Jackson Building is this tile inlaid bullseye on the ground. And I think that's where Scott said people would even see like a dark figure fall from the roof, or what appeared to be a human silhouette plummet from the roof, and they would hear it slap the ground. And sickening crush, that sound of a body blunt, weight hitting the pavement. And then they would rush over there to see, and there was nothing. Or they would even, in some cases, I'm told, probably by Scott, call the police, and they would come to investigate, and there's no sign of it. So phantom suicides from some of the taller buildings around town, that's a matter of fact, I believe, because I've heard it from more than one person.
Oh, yeah. And we're talking with Vance Pollock, Asheville, North Carolina historian. And Vance, I'd like to wrap this segment up on Asheville tonight just by circling back to Helen's Bridge. And interestingly, I discovered that writer Thomas Wolfe used to walk under the bridge and walked under it many times and mentioned it in his book, Look Homeward. So I'm going to have to check that book out now. But Vance, I discovered that there seemed to be two prevailing stories about Helen, who supposedly hung herself off of Helen's Bridge, the bridge to Zealandia. One theory was, you kind of mentioned this, there was a great fire, and she was an anguished mother. Her child was killed in the fire, and she ran to the bridge and hung herself. That's one theory. And another theory that seemed to be kind of prevalent online was that she was actually a jilted, and this kind of ties into the debauchery situation I was talking about earlier, that she was actually pregnant with the current owner's baby. So they were having an affair, and somehow she became jilted. So this was like a jilted, pregnant lovers affair situation where, again, she committed suicide, hung herself off the bridge. What do you think is the real case with Helen, of Helen's Bridge?
I don't know. And there so far hasn't been any evidence come to hand, even though historians, scholars, researchers such as myself keep looking. Maybe the story I told about Harry Burgess revealing him 13 years after we started to investigate, maybe just one day out of the blue, someone will reach out and say, I know who Helen is, and I'll invite any listeners who may run across tonight's podcast to contact me with your theories about who Helen is. What do you think? I mean,
Who was Helen?
there are mediums who claim to have been contacted by the spirit of Helen, and again, I think the thought that it might be Helen Clevenger who was murdered in Asheville in 1936 is at least reasonable, because they say that the wrong man went to the gas chamber for her murder. That's a whole nother can of worms.
Oh, yes, it is.
We really appreciate you joining us tonight. You were so obliging to come on such short notice. I want to say this about my theory about Asheville, and I just have to wonder, it reminds me so much of the movie The Shining, which a Stephen King book, Jack Nicholson, and, he goes to stay in a hotel with a tragic past he apparently is not aware of. And at some point, he looks at a picture on the wall and he realizes he's been there all along. And this stuff just keeps happening over and over and over again. And there's some other mysterious forces at play that maybe we just can never comprehend. Vance, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Vance.
My pleasure.
If
Thanks for having me.
If folks want to find out more about Lemur or your project, the Carolinas in the 60s, or anything else you've got going on, podcasts, etc., you want to give a plug to any of that?
I have to give a shout out to my buddy Joshua P. Warren one more time, and drop by his website, hauntedasheville.com. If you're going to be in the area and you want to take the best haunted tour in Asheville, it's got to be hauntedasheville.com. And you can always read his book of the same title, Haunted Asheville. It's just a great book, and I think he wrote that right out of high school, and it still holds up.
Cool. We'll definitely check it out. Next time in Asheville, I'll definitely do the tour. Hopefully I'll get to meet Joshua himself, and he recommended you come on the show tonight, and it's been terrific. We really appreciate you. Thanks so much. When Vance started saying the words earlier, Helen come forth, Helen come forth,
I know.
I was actually, kind of on edge over here. I was wondering if something would happen, and we've had previous guests, experts in EVP, electronic voice phenomenon, that believe there's a connection between, electricity, computers, wireless. I hear something scribbling right now, and I'm not.
What is that noise?
I'm not doing that. And
I'm not doing that.
And it made me wonder, I think Vance might be in Asheville right now, and we're all connected with this electric energy, this wireless
Stop it.
energy, and
No,
here
stop it
he
right now.
is saying it. I'm just
No.
saying, Gary Arnold would tell you there's some, there could be something there. Electronic voice pioneer, shout out to you, Gary Arnold.
No, I'm legit not going to be able to sleep for weeks. You're going to have to pay for that therapy.
You've been listening to All Things Unexplained. If you liked this podcast, please do give us a 5-star rating and leave us a review. If you would like to hear more All Things Unexplained, be sure to follow us wherever you listen to your podcasts. Our show depends on the support of listeners like you. Find us on Venmo under the business accounts. Just look for @Bigfoot UFO. If you can't get enough of us, go ahead and check us out at allthings-unexplained.com. A special thanks to our producer, director, sound mixer, editor, and the man who wears far too many hats. No, seriously, he wears a lot of hats. Dr. Tim Mounts. Without you, we couldn't keep the lights on. Thanks for listening to All Things Unexplained.